Hello my friends, I hope you're doing well. Today I will be talking about the books that I read in July. The Miles Franklin Award shortlist was announced last month, so I decided that I would theme my reading around previous Miles Franklin award-winning books. There was a few books on the list of winners that I've been meaning to read for ages anyway, so I thought this was a good opportunity to pick those up. One of those was the first book that I read in July, which was Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. So I've watched the film adaptation of this book years ago. I think it was in maybe my first or second year at university, and bizarrely I don't remember anything about the plot of that film. I just sort of remember a vague feeling of thinking it was very odd in a very Australian way. So I wasn't entirely sure what to expect from this book, but I ended up really enjoying it. So this, as the title suggests, is about two characters, Oscar and Lucinda. They don't meet for ages in the plot. So it starts off talking about Oscar and his childhood living in England. His father was an evangelical minister, and Lucinda was the daughter of British immigrants to Australia who were trying to make a life farming in the Australian bush. What binds these two characters together at first is that they both have a love for gambling. This book has been described as Dickensian, and that is pretty much the only way I could think to describe it. There are very obvious references to Dickens as well, with the fact that Lucinda especially, who's a great reader, reads a lot of Dickens. And specifically the way it is like Dickens is that it is packed full of so many characters, and every single character gets a backstory and a motivation. Amazingly, this does not get tiresome at all, because Peter Carey's writing is so incredibly deft and evocative and interesting to read. It's a relatively long book, and in this copy I have anyway, the writing is pretty small, so it did take me a while to get through, but it wasn't a slog in the slightest, for me at least. Probably the only negative thing I have to say about this book is that there wasn't enough about Oscar and Lucinda themselves. I really adored both their characters. I loved how they were incredibly flawed, but both essentially wanted to be good people, and they both in their own ways didn't fit into the society of the 1860s, which is when this is set. Interestingly, the story is supposedly written by an ancestor of Oscar's, and it really highlights one of the major themes of the book, which is people creating a history simply by existing without really realizing the consequences of what they do to generations after them. So one of the main plot points of the book is Lucinda ends up owning a glassworks factory and has this idea of making a glass church, which she decides she wants to send to a reverend that she used to know who now lives in country Australia. Oscar decides that he is going to deliver this glass church to the town, and this results in the history of this glass church having an effect through generations all the way down to the narrator. And it's really fascinating to think about the early white Australians who really had no idea what they were doing, who did change the course of history so drastically for the Aboriginal Australians living here, and who created these weird myths and histories that are scattered throughout country towns in Australia without really meaning to. This is definitely a weird book, but I really think it's worth reading. And it was a kind of weirdness that I really enjoy. The second book I read in July was The Well by Elizabeth Jolley. Elizabeth Jolley was a local Perth author. There's even a lecture theatre at my old university named after her. And she's an author whose name I know of as a famous Australian author. But with famous authors, there is usually one or two books that stand out from their works as their sort of famous work. But with Elizabeth Jolley, when I was looking through her bibliography, none of her books stood out to me as being familiar, so I was quite interested to pick this one up when I saw it was on the list of Miles Franklin Award winners. So this is a book about an older lady, Hester Harper, who owns a farm out in the country, and by the descriptions it does very much sound like country WA. She sort of adopts a teenage girl called Kathy, who is an orphan that she sees working in the town shop, and she hears that the shopkeepers are going to send her back to the orphanage they got her from because they can't afford to keep her in the shop. So Hester decides that she will take her onto her farm and she can help her out there. She soon becomes incredibly attached to Kathy and easily gets jealous if Kathy shows an interest in anyone else. One night they're driving back from town and Hester has let Kathy drive the car, as Kathy just got her license, when they run over something. Hester panics and throws what they've run over down into their well. And what follows is an incredibly creepy, very suspenseful novel. Australians are somewhat good at creating sort of horror thriller works of fiction. To us white people, the bush is an incredibly scary place, and so almost anything set in the bush does have that creepy vibe of the unknown and the uncontrollable. You're very much inside Hester's head throughout the whole story, and you can really see her mind slightly unraveling as she is desperate to hold on to the life that she and Kathy have been happily living together for the past few years. I only felt that the end let it down a bit. I didn't feel satisfied by it, but yeah, I'm really glad I read it, and I'd be kind of interested to read some other Elizabeth Jolley. Next, I read Eucalyptus by Murray Bale. This is a book I've been meaning to read for a while, as my mum said it was one of her favourite books. Unfortunately, I didn't enjoy it very much at all. It's kind of an Australian fairy tale in that there is a man who buys an enormous property in country New South Wales, and there is a definite theme here of a lot of these Miles Franklin winners being set in the country, which I find kind of interesting. So this man has a huge property and decides he is going to try and plant every single species of eucalyptus tree that he can find. The man has a daughter who grows up, and pretty much her only character trait is that she's the most beautiful woman that anyone has ever seen. And so of course all the men in the town are interested in her, so her father, not knowing how to deal with all these suitors, decides that only the man who can name every single eucalyptus tree on his property can marry his daughter. Now, I get that this is meant to be a fairy tale, and that is an incredibly fairy tale thing to happen, but already that grated me, and even more than the fact that the father thought he can control his daughter like that, but more that she didn't say anything. There is eventually one man who begins to succeed in naming all the trees, because there's so many it takes him several days. Ellen does not want to marry him as he is about the same age as her father, but she never actually says this out loud to her father. Instead, she meets some other man who starts telling her a bunch of stories, and so the second half of the novel is not even the main story, it's just a bunch of little stories told by this man, which I always find super frustrating in a book because it makes it really hard to get into the story when there are a bunch of other little stories that have no real bearing to the plot itself. Yeah, I really didn't like this one. It's kind of funny because I was reading this on the bus and a lady leaned over and said, "Oh, that's my favorite book," and I didn't know what to say because I was not enjoying it, so I just said, "Oh, awesome," which she probably kind of got offended by. The last book I read in July was Breath by Tim Winton. I was originally going to read Dirt Music, but Oscar and Lucinda took me so long to read that I didn't have a lot of time left in July, and Dirt Music is also quite a long book, so I picked up Breath instead, as this one was only about 200 pages. So this is about two adolescent boys living in a mill town in the southwest of Australia. They become fascinated by the beach and surfing, and they eventually meet this guy Sando, who starts teaching them about the ways of surfing. I was not sure if I would enjoy this, as I have no interest in surfing or the beach in general. However, Tim Winton managed to make me understand why people like surfing. There was a really great sentence in the book which is set in the 1970s, I think, which talks about how all the men in this mill town do very practical things and never get to do anything beautiful, whereas surfing for the narrator is a beautiful art form. He felt like it was the only thing that he as a man at that time could do to express his artistic side. Tim Winton's writing is amazing. I've only read Cloud Street from him before, which has a quite poetic style, so I sort of assumed that all his books would be like that, but this book was much more straightforward in the way it was written, but still written in a really beautiful way. I think for me it was helped by the fact that I have been to mill towns in the southwest and the beach in the southwest, and I know exactly what places like that look like. I know Tim Winton's most recent book has been heralded as talking about toxic masculinity, and I think this book in some ways is doing the same thing. It is about how these teenage boys and this older man Sando, they weren't allowed to talk about their feelings. They certainly weren't able to do that with their own parent, and so surfing was a way for them to let out all those emotions that they had bottled up inside. There was a film adaptation that came out this year which did not get the best reviews, and I can kind of understand why, because I don't really see it as a book that needs to be adapted. There is a certain plot line involving Eve and the narrator that seen visually would be incredibly disturbing, but obviously written out it's a lot easier to understand why Tim Winton has included this, and he's very clear to state that he does not see this as a romantic thing or a good thing. He completely sees it as an incredibly damaging and negative thing that the narrator experiences. So that is all the books I read in July. I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye!